The massive doors of the council chamber slid open with a soft hiss. General Deho walked inside, his boots clicking against the polished floor. Behind him came Captain Jiwon and Lieutenant Hana, both carrying data tablets. The three humans looked small in the enormous room built for creatures much larger than them. The Valdris station orbited a dead planet on the edge of concordate space. This military station was home to thousands of alien soldiers from dozens of different worlds. The council chamber sat at the station's center, a place where the most powerful military commanders in the galaxy made their decisions. Today they would judge Earth's worth. General Deho was 63 years old. His hair had turned gray years ago and deep lines marked his face. He had spent 40 years in Earth's military, fighting in 3 different wars before humanity ever met alien life. Now he commanded all human forces in concordate space. 5,000 soldiers answered to him, a tiny number compared to the millions that other species contributed. The council members sat in a half-circle of elevated seats. Each seat held a different alien species. Some looked like insects, others like reptiles, and some defied any earthly comparison. They all stared down at the 3 humans with expressions that ranged from boredom to barely hidden contempt. High Commander Velrith spoke first. He was a Korvax, standing 9 feet tall with blue crystalline skin that reflected the room's lights. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. General Deho of Earth, you requested this meeting to present your military doctrine. The council has granted you 20 minutes. Begin. Deho bowed slightly, a gesture of respect. Then he activated the holographic projector. Images filled the air above the council floor. The first image showed human soldiers running across rough terrain, carrying heavy packs. Members of the council, Deho began, his voice calm and clear. Humanity offers a military tradition spanning 10,000 years. Our doctrine emphasizes 3 core principles: physical conditioning, tactical discipline, and adaptability without technology dependence. The next image showed soldiers climbing ropes, crawling under barriers and jumping over walls. Another showed formations of troops marching in perfect unison across a desert. Then came footage of hand-to-hand combat training, soldiers grappling and striking in controlled exercises. War Marshal Threxus leaned forward in his seat. He was a Mandalar with 6 arms and a body covered in thick armor plates. His mechanical translator made his laughter sound like grinding metal. General, forgive my confusion. Are you showing us exercise, physical exercise? Several council members made sounds that their translators rendered as chuckles and snorts. Deho continued as if he hadn't heard. Human soldiers train for 6 months before deployment. They learn to march 30 kilometers in full gear. They practice close combat for 2 hours daily. They study historical battles and learn to think tactically without computer assistance. Without computer assistance? Admiral Quinteris interrupted. She was a silicate, her body made of living crystal that pulsed with inner light. General, we have neural interface technology that allows instant tactical coordination across entire armies. Why would anyone fight without computational support? Our history teaches us that technology can fail, Deho replied. He changed the image to show soldiers training in darkness and snow and rain. We prepare our troops to function in any environment, with or without advanced equipment. This time the laughter was louder and more widespread. War Marshal Threxus gestured with 3 of his 6 arms. Forgive me, General, but this is absurd. You're showing us training methods from your species' primitive past. We left such things behind millennia ago when we developed drone warfare. Why would we ever need soldiers who can, what did you call it, march? High Commander Velrith held up one massive hand, calling for silence. General Deho, I believe the Council's concern is clear. Modern warfare relies on orbital bombardment, automated defense systems, and drone swarms. Infantry combat, especially the type requiring physical conditioning, is essentially obsolete. When was the last time any concorded species engaged in hand-to-hand combat? The Ravager Collective uses close combat, Deho said quietly. The chamber went silent for a moment. Then Admiral Quinteris spoke, her voice sharp. The Ravagers are barbarians. They attack with biological weapons and brute force because they're too primitive to develop proper military technology. When they encounter our automated defenses, they're destroyed. Comparing concordant doctrine to Ravager tactics is insulting. Deho bowed again. I meant no insult, Admiral. I merely point out that diverse threats require diverse responses. Humanity's methods may seem old-fashioned, but they've proven effective across countless conflicts. Effective against other humans, perhaps, Velrith said, but irrelevant in modern galactic warfare. Tell me, General, what happens when an orbital strike destroys your troops before they can march to the battlefield? What good is hand-to-hand combat training against enemies that never come within a kilometer of your position? Captain Jiwan stepped forward, speaking for the first time. High Commander, if I may. Human doctrine accounts for combined arms operations. We're not suggesting that physical training replaces technology. We're proposing it as a foundation that makes technology more effective. War Marshal Threxus made a dismissive gesture. Captain, with respect, you're describing a solution in search of a problem. The Concordat has been fighting wars for 10,000 years. We've refined our methods across millions of battles. Your species has been in space for less than a century. Perhaps you should learn from us rather than trying to teach us your primitive exercises. The other council members made sounds of agreement. Deho could see that his presentation was failing. These beings had advanced technology that humanity could barely understand. They commanded fleets that could destroy planets. They coordinated armies across light years of space using quantum communication networks. To them, human soldiers running obstacle courses and practicing with knives looked like children playing war games. High Commander Velrith consulted with the other council members in a rapid exchange of alien languages. Then he turned back to the humans. General Deho, the council has reached a decision. Your presentation was interesting. However, we cannot in good conscience assign human forces to frontline combat roles. Your training methods are too far outside standard Concordat doctrine, and frankly, we worry that your troops would be a liability in actual combat situations. Lieutenant Hana tensed, her hand tightening on her data tablet. Captain Jiwan's expression remained neutral, but her jaw clenched. General Deho simply stood still, waiting. Therefore, Velrith continued, we are assigning all human forces to garrison duty on Kalis 7, a mining world in Sector 47. It's far from the current conflict zones and requires minimal military oversight. You'll monitor sensor arrays and maintain a defensive presence. Consider it an opportunity to observe how actual galactic warfare operates. Admiral Quinteris added, this assignment is for your own protection, General. We've seen promising young species destroyed because they entered combat before they were ready. Humanity shows potential, but you need time to adapt to modern warfare. A quiet garrison posting will give you that time. War Marshal Threxus couldn't resist a final comment. And perhaps you can use that time to study real military tactics instead of teaching your soldiers to do push-ups. The council chamber filled with alien laughter again. Deho felt Captain Jiwan shift beside him, anger radiating from her posture. Lieutenant Hana's face had gone red, but Deho himself remained perfectly calm. Something in his expression changed just slightly. The corners of his mouth curved upward in the smallest of smiles. It was not a warm smile or a friendly one. It was cold and hard like ice forming on a winter lake. The council's decision is acknowledged, Deho said, his voice even and professional. Human forces will deploy to Kalis 7 immediately. We are grateful for the assignment and will execute our garrison duties to the best of our abilities. He bowed formally, then turned and walked toward the exit. Jiwan and Hana followed, both struggling to hide their emotions. As the doors closed behind them, Velrith turned to the other council members. That went better than expected, the High Commander said. I was worried they'd argue or make demands. At least they're reasonable enough to accept their limitations. I almost feel sorry for them, Admiral Quinteris added. All that pride in their primitive methods, and they still don't understand how outclassed they are. In the corridor outside, Lieutenant Hana finally let her anger show. General, they humiliated us in there. They laughed at everything we've accomplished. They called our methods primitive and useless. And you just smiled and accepted their insult of an assignment. Deho stopped walking and turned to face his officers. That cold smile was still on his face. Lieutenant, how long have you served under my command? 3 years, sir. And in those 3 years, have you ever known me to smile when I'm happy? Hana paused, thinking. No, sir. You smile when you're planning something. The transport ships descended through thick clouds toward Kalis 7's surface. Inside the lead vessel, soldiers pressed against the viewports, getting their first look at their new home. What they saw made several of them groan out loud. The planet was gray and brown, covered in rocks and dust. Sharp mountains jutted up like broken teeth. Deep canyons split the surface in jagged lines. Here and there, mining facilities dotted the landscape. their metal structures looking small and lonely against the harsh terrain. The sky had a yellow tint from the atmospheric chemicals, and even from orbit they could see dust storms sweeping across the surface. "It looks like hell decided to open a mining operation," muttered Private Dongwu, a young soldier from Seoul. He was 22 years old and had joined the military 3 years ago. This was his first deployment off Earth. Beside him, Sergeant Borum laughed. She was a veteran of 15 years, originally from Busan. Her arms bore scars from combat in Earth's last territorial war. "I've served in worse places. At least this one has breathable air even if we need respirators. Stop complaining and start thinking about how to use that terrain." The landing was rough. Kalis 7's gravity was 40% stronger than Earth normal, which meant everything felt heavier the moment they stepped off the transport. Several soldiers stumbled as they adjusted to the increased weight. Packs that were manageable on Earth now felt like they were filled with rocks. Lieutenant Hana was the first officer off the transport. She immediately fell into a push-up position and knocked out 20 reps, her face showing strain but not stopping. "If I can do it, so can you," she shouted to the watching soldiers. "This gravity is going to make us stronger. 3 months from now you'll thank me. Now move your gear to the assembly area." The main human base was a prefabricated structure near the largest mining complex. It could house 5,000 people, though calling it comfortable would be generous. The buildings were basic, the food was bland, and the water tasted metallic. But General Daeho had made sure they had everything they needed for training. On the second day, the general gathered all personnel in the main assembly hall. 5,000 faces looked up at him, expressions ranging from curious to disappointed. Many had hoped for real combat assignments. Instead, they got garrison duty on a mining world nobody cared about. "I know what you're thinking," Daeho began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You joined the military to defend humanity. You trained for combat. And now you're here, on a rock in the middle of nowhere, doing a job that anyone could do. You feel like you've been wasted." Nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "You're right to feel that way," Daeho continued. "Because officially, that's exactly what happened. The Concordat thinks we're not good enough for real fighting. They put us here because they think we can't mess up anything important." He paused, letting that sink in. "But I'm going to tell you what's really happening. We're not here for garrison duty. We're here to prepare for war." The murmuring stopped. Every eye focused on the general. Kalis 7 has deposits of tritarium, one of the rarest minerals in the galaxy. It's used in faster-than-light drives. Right now, the Concordat thinks this planet is too far from the fighting to matter. But wars spread. Resources become targets. Eventually, the Ravager Collective will come here. Daeho's voice grew harder. "And when they do, we're going to show them something they've never seen before." He gestured to Lieutenant Hana. "Starting tomorrow, we begin intensive training. We're going to use this gravity to build strength. We're going to map every meter of this terrain. We're going to prepare defensive positions at every strategic location. And we're going to do it all without relying on technology that can be disabled or destroyed." Captain Jiwon stepped forward, activating a holographic map of the region. "We've identified 43 defensive positions around the mining complex. Each needs to be fortified. We're going to dig trenches, build bunkers, and create supply caches. This is manual labor, and it's going to be hard in this gravity. We'll also be training for combat in this environment," Hana added. "The high gravity affects everything. How fast you can move, how far you can throw, how quickly you tire. We need to adapt. Every day will include physical conditioning, tactical drills, and close-quarters combat training." Sergeant Borum spoke next. "Some of you are thinking this sounds like punishment. It's not. This is preparation. The Concordat fights with drones and orbital weapons. When those fail, they have nothing. We're going to have everything. We're going to know this ground better than we know our own homes. We're going to be so strong in this gravity that normal gravity will feel like flying, and we're going to be ready to fight in any condition." The speech worked. Soldiers who had been disappointed now looked determined. They might not understand the full picture, but they trusted their commanders. If General Daeho said war was coming, war was coming. The training began the next morning before dawn. The increased gravity made every exercise harder. Soldiers ran carrying packs, their legs burning with effort. They climbed ropes until their arms shook. They practiced combat drills until they moved on instinct rather than thought. Private Dongwu struggled at first. The gravity seemed to press down on his chest, making breathing difficult. During a 10-kilometer run, he fell behind the others, his lungs burning. Sergeant Borum dropped back to run beside him. Keep moving, she said. Don't think about the distance. Just focus on the next step. I can't. Too heavy. Dongwu gasped. Yes, you can. You know why? Because humans are the best endurance runners on Earth. We evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. This gravity is nothing compared to what your ancestors overcame. She pushed him forward. Move! Dongwu kept running. His body screamed for him to stop, but he pushed through. When he finally crossed the finish line, he collapsed onto his hands and knees, breathing heavily. But he had made it. While the soldiers trained, Captain Jiwan led teams exploring the terrain. They mapped every canyon, every cave, every ridge. They marked locations for defensive positions and supply caches. They found natural choke points where a small force could hold off a larger one. Engineer Minwoo, recently promoted after the orbital frigate assignment, worked with technical teams to understand the planet's limitations. The atmospheric chemicals interfered with many sensors. Dust storms disrupted communications. The mining equipment created electromagnetic noise that masked signatures. It was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. General, Minwoo reported one evening, this planet is terrible for advanced technology. Half our sensors don't work properly. Communication beyond line of sight is unreliable. Even our own equipment gives us trouble. Daeho smiled his cold smile. Perfect. That means any attacker will have the same problems. We'll be fighting on equal terms, and equal terms favor the better trained force. Weeks turned into months. The soldiers adapted to the gravity. What had been exhausting became manageable, then easy. They could run farther, lift more, fight harder. When supply ships arrived with new personnel from Earth, the veterans watched with amusement as the newcomers struggled with the same challenges they had overcome. Private Kyung-soo, a former engineering student from Daegu, found a new purpose designing improvised weapons. He created simple but effective devices that didn't rely on electronics. Mechanical traps, chemical explosives, and gravity-based weapons. If they can disable our technology, we'll just use physics instead, he explained while demonstrating a crossbow that could punch through armor. Medic Suman set up a field hospital in a cave system near the main complex. She trained other medics in battlefield surgery without automated equipment. In real combat, the machines might not work, she told her students. You need to know how to save lives with your hands and basic tools. 6 months after arrival, General Daeho stood on a ridge overlooking the main mining complex. Captain Jiwon joined him carrying reports. The defensive positions are complete, she said. We have 43 fortified locations connected by underground tunnels. Supply caches at every position. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. We can hold indefinitely if needed. And the troops? Better than I expected. The gravity training has made them incredibly strong. Combat proficiency is at 97%. Morale is high. They believe in what we're doing. She paused. But General, what if you're wrong? What if the Ravagers never come here? Daeho pointed at the sky where stars were beginning to appear in the evening. They'll come. I've been reading Engineer Minwoo's reports on concordant communications. The war is going badly. The Ravagers have broken through 6 defensive lines in the past 4 months. They're not just winning battles, they're conquering entire sectors. How? Jiwon asked. The Concordat has superior technology. That's exactly why they're losing. The Ravagers have figured out how to disable advanced technology with electromagnetic pulse weapons. When the electronics stop working, Concordat forces fall apart. They don't know how to fight without their computers and drones. The Ravagers, on the other hand, use biological weapons in close combat. Their warriors are bred for melee fighting. Understanding dawned on Jiwon's face. And when they come here... Engineer Minwoo was drinking coffee in the orbital monitoring station when the alarm started screaming. He dropped his cup, watching it fall slowly in the low gravity as he rushed to the sensor console. What he saw there made his blood turn cold. 47 massive energy signatures had just appeared at the edge of the system. They were coming fast, accelerating toward Callus 7 with clear hostile intent. Minwoo's hands flew across the controls, trying to get more information. The computer identified the signatures as Ravager warships, each one capable of destroying a city. This is Engineer Minwoo to General Daeho, he said into the communication system, forcing his voice to stay calm. We have incoming hostile vessels. 47 Ravager warships, ETA to orbit is 18 minutes. Repeat, we have major hostile contact. On the surface, alarm sirens began wailing across the human base. Soldiers dropped what they were doing and ran to their assigned positions. They had drilled this scenario 100 times. Everyone knew exactly where to go and what to do. General Daeho reached the command center in less than 2 minutes. Captain Jiwon was already there, activating defensive systems. Lieutenant Hana was coordinating troop movements across the base communication network. "Status," Daeho ordered. 47 warships confirmed, Jiwon replied, her fingers moving rapidly across her console. "Our 3 orbital frigates are moving to intercept, but General, we're massively outnumbered. 3 ships against 47. We can't win this fight. We don't need to win in orbit. We just need to buy time." Daeho activated the communication link to Minwoo's station. "Engineer, how long until concordant reinforcements arrive?" "Nearest response fleet is 17 hours away," Minwoo replied. "General, we need to evacuate the orbital station. These ships are launching attack fighters. We're going to be destroyed." "Get everyone into the escape pods and get to the surface," Daeho ordered. "We'll need every person we can get. Move now." In orbit, the 3 human frigates were already engaging the Ravager fleet. They were old ships, smaller and weaker than the Concordant vessels, but their crews fought with desperate courage. Missiles streaked across the void. Energy weapons flashed in the darkness. The frigates managed to destroy 2 Ravager ships before the overwhelming firepower tore them apart. Minwoo and his crew of 30 engineers abandoned the monitoring station just as Ravager fighters began their attack runs. Escape pods launched into space, small metal spheres falling toward the planet's surface while explosions bloomed behind them. Minwoo watched through a viewport as the station where he'd worked for 6 months was torn apart by weapons fire. The pods entered Cala 7's atmosphere hard and fast. The descent was violent, shaking everyone inside until their teeth rattled. But the pods were designed for this, and all 31 reached the surface intact, landing within 5 kilometers of the main human base. Recovery teams were already waiting to bring the orbital crew to safety. Above them, Ravager dropships began falling like deadly rain. Hundreds of them, each carrying combat troops. They descended toward the mining complex and the surrounding territory, engines roaring as they came down through the yellow sky. "Here we go," Lieutenant Hana said quietly, watching the descent on her tactical display. "All units confirm ready status." Reports came flooding in from all 43 defensive positions. Every unit was in place, armed and ready. 43 acknowledgments, each one representing soldiers who knew what was coming and stood firm anyway. The dropships landed in waves. Their ramps slammed down, and the Ravagers emerged into Cala 7's gravity and thin atmosphere. These were the creatures that had conquered a dozen worlds in the past year. Each one stood 8 feet tall, covered in thick chitinous armor that looked like it had grown naturally from their bodies. They moved on 4 legs but could rear up on 2 to use their front limbs as arms. Sharp claws extended from each limb capable of tearing through metal. Private Dongwoo watched from his defensive position as the first Ravagers appeared. He had seen images during briefings, but seeing them in person was different. They were terrifying, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for their size. He gripped his rifle tighter, feeling sweat on his palms despite the cool temperature. "Steady," Sergeant Borum's voice came through his helmet communication. "Let them come. We control this ground, not them." The Ravagers organized into packs of about 20 warriors each, led by larger Alpha commanders. They began advancing toward the mining complex, moving in coordinated patterns that showed intelligence and tactical thinking. 15,000 warriors had landed in the first wave, outnumbering the human defenders 3 to 1. Then the electromagnetic pulse bombs detonated. The Ravagers had used this tactic on every world they conquered. Massive EMP devices that shut down all advanced electronics in a wide radius. Computers died. Sensors went dark. Communication systems failed. Automated defenses stopped working. It was the Ravagers' signature move, and it had never failed to create chaos among their enemies. But the human defenders had trained for exactly this scenario. All units switched to backup systems. General Daeho's voice came through mechanical radio systems that didn't rely on computers. "Execute defensive plan Alpha. Manual targeting only. Make every shot count." The Ravagers expected confusion and panic. Instead, they found organized resistance. The human defenders had backup systems for everything: mechanical radios for communication, manual sights for weapons, chemical markers for position identification. They had practiced fighting without electronics until it became natural. The first Ravager pack entered the mining complex expecting to find helpless prey. Instead, they walked into an ambush. Lieutenant Hana's team had positioned themselves in the complex's tunnel systems, using the narrow spaces to their advantage. When the Ravagers entered the first corridor, explosives detonated above and behind them, collapsing the tunnel and trapping them in a kill zone. Human soldiers opened fire from concealed positions. Bullets tore into the Ravagers, finding gaps in their armor. The aliens were tough, their natural protection absorbing hits that would kill most creatures, but concentrated fire from multiple angles brought them down. The pack leader, a massive alpha, tried to rally his warriors, but a well-placed explosive charge brought a support beam down on his head. The battle spread across the mining complex and the surrounding terrain. Ravagers attacked from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. But the humans had spent months preparing these positions. Every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Every pathway had traps and obstacles. On the surface, Sergeant Borum's artillery teams operated manually aimed railguns. Without computer targeting, they had to calculate trajectories by hand, accounting for wind, gravity, and distance. It was slower than automated systems, but it worked. Heavy metal slugs crashed into Ravager formations, scattering them and disrupting their advances. Private Kyung-Soo's improvised weapons proved their worth. Mechanical traps crushed Ravagers under falling rocks. Chemical explosives created clouds of caustic gas that ate through their armor. Old-fashioned landmines turned the approaches to human positions into deadly mazes. But the Ravagers were learning. They adapted their tactics, sending smaller groups to probe defenses and find weaknesses. They used their superior numbers to attack multiple positions simultaneously, trying to spread the defenders too thin. The real test came when a Ravager Alpha commander, larger and more heavily armored than the others, broke through the defensive line at position 17. This creature stood over 9 feet tall, its armor plates thick enough to deflect most weapons' fire. It killed 12 soldiers in the first minute, moving with terrifying speed and power. Its claws tore through body armor like paper. Its roars shook the ground. Private Dongwu saw it happen. He watched good soldiers, people he'd trained with and lived beside for months, die in seconds. Fear flooded through him, cold and paralyzing. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to survive. Then he remembered Sergeant Borum's words from his first day on Kali 7. Humans are the best endurance runners on Earth. We evolved to chase prey until it collapsed. He remembered General Daeho's speech about humanity's 10,000 years of warfare. He remembered every drill, every training session, every moment of preparation. Dongwu dropped his rifle. It was useless against that armor at close range. Instead, he drew his combat knife, a simple blade of high-carbon steel. Around him, other soldiers were retreating, pulling back to secondary positions. But if they let this alpha through, it would tear apart their entire defensive line. Someone had to stop it. Dongwu ran forward, shouting at the top of his lungs. The alpha turned toward him, its eyes reflecting something that might have been surprise. A human soldier, small and fragile compared to the alien warrior, charging directly at it with nothing but a knife. The alpha's claw swung at Dongwu's head, fast enough to decapitate him. But months of training in heavy gravity had made Dongwu faster than he'd ever been. He dropped and rolled under the strike, coming up inside the creature's reach. His knife found a gap in the armor where the leg joint connected to the body. He stabbed upward with all his strength. War Prime Skrell studied the battlefield reports in his command ship, his four eyes narrowing with something that might have been respect or might have been rage. In 300 years of conquest, he had never seen a defending force hold against the first assault. The small creatures from Earth had done what advanced civilizations could not. They had stood and fought. Around him, his war council waited nervously. These were veteran commanders who had conquered dozens of worlds, and they could all see the anger building in their leader's massive frame. Skrell stood 10 feet tall, covered in battle scars from 100 victories. When he finally spoke, his voice was like grinding stone. We underestimated them. We thought they would be like the others, helpless without their machines. We were wrong. He turned to his council. Deploy everything. All remaining warriors, every siege weapon, every asset we have. I want these humans crushed completely. No survivors, no mercy, no hesitation. On Kali 7's surface, General Daeho received the same conclusion from his own intelligence. Engineer Minwoo had managed to intercept some Ravager communications before the electromagnetic pulse damaged his equipment. The translation was rough but clear enough. A second wave was coming, and it would be far worse than the first. 30,000 warriors, Deho told his assembled officers. Everything they have, plus siege beasts, biological weapons designed to break fortifications. He looked around the command center at tired, wounded faces. We can't hold the outer positions against that kind of force. We need to consolidate. Lieutenant Hana brought up a tactical map. The mining complex's central fortress. It's built into the mountain, defensible from all sides, and we've spent months preparing it for exactly this scenario. Captain Jiwon nodded. We'll need to conduct a fighting withdrawal. Fall back position by position, make them pay for every meter, and get everyone to the fortress before they can surround us. Sergeant Borum, Deho said, can your teams rig the outer positions for demolition? Borum smiled grimly. Sir, I've had charges set for 3 months. Every position we abandon will turn into a crater, 5 minutes after we leave. The Ravagers want this ground, they can have it full of holes. The withdrawal orders went out immediately. Units began pulling back from the outermost defensive positions, moving toward the central fortress in coordinated stages. But this wasn't a panicked retreat. Every step was planned, every movement covered by other units. Private Dongwu, still bandaged from his fight with the Alpha, helped carry wounded soldiers during the withdrawal. The young man who had struggled with the gravity 6 months ago now moved easily through the harsh terrain, carrying injured comrades who outweighed him. The training had made him strong, but the battle had made him determined. The Ravagers advanced cautiously at first, expecting traps and ambushes. They were right to be careful. Sergeant Borum's demolition teams had turned the defensive positions into killing zones. When Ravagers occupied an abandoned bunker, timed charges would detonate, bringing the entire structure down. When they tried to use human supply tunnels, chemical traps released caustic gases. Private Kyungsu had outdone himself with delayed action weapons. Mechanical devices that looked broken, but would suddenly activate when disturbed. Explosive charges hidden in equipment that the Ravagers might try to use. Every step forward cost the enemy warriors, slowing their advance and damaging their morale. By mid-morning, the human forces had consolidated at the fortress. This was Deho's masterwork, a defensive position built into the mountain itself. The fortress had 3 layers of walls, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The mountain's caves had been converted into supply depots, barracks, and medical facilities. Tunnels connected different sections, allowing troops to move without being exposed to surface fire. Medic Suman had established her main hospital deep in the mountain caves. Wounded soldiers filled the available beds and spilled onto the floor. She moved between them with practiced efficiency, treating injuries with a combination of advanced medical supplies and basic field surgery. When the power failed in one section, she continued working by flashlight without missing a beat. How many can fight? General Deho asked her during a brief visit. Suman didn't look up from the soldier she was treating. About 40% of the wounded can return to duty with medication and pain management. The rest need time to heal properly, but we don't have time, do we? No, we don't. Deho watched her work for a moment. You're doing good work here, medic. Tell me that when we all survive, General. The Ravager assault on the fortress began at noon with a massive artillery barrage. Biological projectiles crashed against the walls, releasing acids that ate at the stone and metal. But the fortress had been built to withstand this, with reinforced structures and chemical-resistant coatings. Then came the warriors, thousands of them climbing the mountain approaches in organized waves. They moved with terrifying coordination, each pack supporting the others, creating a tide of armored bodies that seemed unstoppable. The first defensive layer was the mountain approaches themselves. Human artillery teams, now down to half strength but still fighting, fired their manually aimed railguns into the advancing masses. Each shot was calculated by hand, accounting for distance, wind, and the enemy's movement. The training paid off. Shells crashed into Ravager formations with deadly accuracy. When the Ravagers reached the first wall, they found it defended by soldiers who had trained for exactly this moment. Lieutenant Hana commanded the wall defenses, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle. Controlled fire! Pick your targets. Make them pay for every step. The fighting on the walls was brutal. Ravagers tried to climb using their claws only to be met by human soldiers with rifles, grenades, and improvised weapons. The defenders had height advantage and knew every defensive position. They had trained in these exact locations hundreds of times. But the sheer numbers were overwhelming. The Ravagers kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their own dead to reach the walls. When they got close enough, the combat turned to hand-to-hand fighting. This was where months of close combat training proved essential. Sergeant Borum fought on the western wall, her combat knife flashing as she engaged Ravagers who had made it over the barrier. She moved with practiced efficiency, targeting weak points and using the enemy's size against them. When her knife broke, she picked up a piece of debris and kept fighting. When that broke, she used her hands. The second defensive layer was the inner courtyard. When sections of the first wall were breached, defenders fell back to prepared positions in the courtyard, turning it into another killing zone. Private Kyungsu's traps were everywhere, mechanical devices that activated when Ravagers stepped on pressure plates or triggered laser sensors. Engineer Minwoo, now fighting as a regular soldier since his orbital duties were finished, operated a manual targeting system for one of the courtyard's heavy weapons. Without computer assistance, he had to aim by eye and feel, adjusting for the recoil after each shot. It was exhausting work, but he kept firing, kept fighting, kept doing whatever small part he could to hold the line. The siege beasts arrived in the afternoon. These were biological weapons, 12 feet tall and covered in armor even thicker than the regular warriors. They had been engineered specifically to break fortifications with claws that could tear through metal and strength that could topple walls. The first siege beast reached the main gate and began smashing it with massive blows. Each impact shook the entire fortress. Human defenders poured fire into the creature, but their weapons barely scratched its armor. It seemed unstoppable. Private Dongwoo watched from a nearby position, his hands gripping his rifle uselessly. The beast was too heavily armored for conventional weapons. They needed something bigger, something that could penetrate that natural armor. An idea formed in his mind, desperate and probably suicidal, but it might work. "Cover me," he said to the soldiers around him. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed an explosive charge and ran toward the siege beast. The creature saw him coming and swung one massive claw. Dongwoo slid under it, the training in heavy gravity giving him speed and agility. He came up next to the beast's leg and jammed the explosive charge into the joint where leg met body, then threw himself away as hard as he could. The explosion was massive at such close range. The siege beast's leg shattered, and the creature toppled sideways, crashing into the wall it had been attacking. Dongwoo lay on the ground, barely conscious, his body battered by the blast. But the siege beast was down and the gate had held. Medics rushed to retrieve him. As they carried him away, Sergeant Borum shouted after him, "If you survive this, I'm recommending you for every medal we have, you reckless fool." The battle continued into the night without pause. The Ravagers seemed endless, wave after wave attacking the fortress. The human defenders grew exhausted, their ammunition running low, their bodies pushed beyond normal limits. But they held. As midnight approached, the situation became desperate. The Ravagers controlled the first wall and were pushing into the courtyard. Casualties were mounting. Nearly half the human force was dead or too wounded, too. 3 days after the battle ended, the Concordate battleship Sovereign Light settled into orbit around Calais 7. Inside its massive conference chamber, the military council convened an emergency session. High Commander Velrith, War Marshal Threxus, Admiral Quinteris, and a dozen other alien leaders gathered to inspect what they had dismissed as unimportant just months earlier. They had come expecting to find ruins and casualties. Instead, their sensors showed an intact fortress still broadcasting human signals. The flag of Earth still flew above the central structure. The same soldiers they had mocked as primitive were standing guard at their posts, weapons ready, as if the Ravagers might return at any moment. On the surface, General Daeho waited in the fortress courtyard. He leaned heavily on a cane, his body wrapped in bandages from the wounds War Prime Skrell had inflicted. Beside him stood the survivors, Captain Jiwon with her left arm in a sling, Lieutenant Hana with new scars across her face, Engineer Minwoo still wearing his stained combat gear, Sergeant Borum who had held the western wall alone for 4 hours, and Private Dongwoo who had twice done the impossible. Of the 5,000 soldiers who had deployed to Calais 7, fewer than 3,000 could still stand. The rest were dead or too wounded to move, but those who remained stood straight, their uniforms torn and bloody but their bearing proud. The Concordate delegation arrived in armored transports. High Commander Velrith emerged first, his blue crystalline form reflecting the sunlight. His expression was difficult for humans to read, But there was something different in his posture. Not contempt this time, something closer to uncertainty. Behind him came the other council members. War Marshal Threxus walked slowly, all 6 of his arms held in neutral positions. Admiral Quintaris moved with unusual caution. They had all read the reports. They had all seen the battlefield analysis. The numbers didn't seem possible, but the evidence was everywhere. The council members walked through the fortress, and what they saw silenced them completely. Every wall was scarred by weapons fire and acid burns. Every surface bore the marks of desperate combat. The courtyard was still stained with blood, both human and Ravager. Wrecked siege weapons and fallen warriors littered the approaches, but more striking than the destruction was the organization. The human defenders had already begun repairs. Supply lines were being re-established. Defensive positions were being reinforced. Medical facilities were treating the wounded with efficient precision. This wasn't the chaos of a barely survived battle. This was a military force that had won and was preparing for the next fight. In a cleared area near the command center, bodies lay in organized rows awaiting burial. Over 2,000 human soldiers who would never see Earth again. The council members walked past them in silence, finally understanding the price of what had happened here. The formal briefing took place in the fortress's main hall, the same place where General Deho and War Prime Skrell had fought their brutal duel. Repairs had cleared most of the damage, but bloodstains still marked the floor and walls. General Deho stood at attention despite his injuries, facing the council that had dismissed him months earlier. His surviving officers stood beside him. None of them showed any satisfaction or smugness. They were too tired and had lost too many friends for celebration. High Commander Velrith spoke first, and for the first time since meeting humans, his voice carried genuine respect. General Deho, the Concordat Military Council owes humanity a formal apology. We were wrong about your methods. We were wrong about your capabilities. He paused. We were arrogant fools who dismissed you because we didn't understand you. The other council members made sounds of agreement, though some looked uncomfortable admitting their mistake. The council requests a full briefing, Velrith continued. We need to understand how you accomplished this. How did 5,000 soldiers with minimal technological support defeat a Ravager force 3 times your size? How did you hold when species with far more resources have fallen? General Deho glanced at his officers, then spoke in a measured tone. High Commander, the explanation is both simple and difficult. Simple in execution, difficult for species who have forgotten certain truths about warfare. He activated a display showing Earth's military history. Images of ancient battles, medieval sieges, modern warfare. 10,000 years of human conflict compressed into a presentation. Every species in the Concordat has been in space for thousands of years. You've been fighting with advanced technology for so long that you've forgotten how to fight without it. Your soldiers are trained to operate weapon systems, not to be warriors themselves. Captain Jiwan picked up the explanation. When the Ravagers deployed their electromagnetic pulse weapons, they disabled your advanced systems. Your forces became helpless because they had never learned to function without those systems. They couldn't communicate without quantum networks, couldn't target without computer assistance, couldn't coordinate without artificial intelligence support. Humanity spent most of our history fighting with primitive weapons, Lieutenant Hanna added. Rocks, spears, swords, early firearms. We learned to be soldiers before we learned to be technicians. When the Ravagers took away our advanced technology, we still had 10,000 years of tactical knowledge to draw upon. War Marshal Threxus leaned forward, his translator making his voice sound thoughtful. But the physical training? The exercises we mocked? How did those help? Sergeant Borum stepped forward. Permission to speak, General? Deho nodded. War Marshal, combat isn't just about weapons. It's about will, endurance, and determination. Those drills you dismissed as primitive-built soldiers who could fight all day without tiring, who could carry wounded comrades across rough terrain, who could function on minimal food and sleep. Technology makes war easier, but it doesn't make warriors. Training does that. Admiral Quintaris studied the human officers with her crystalline eyes. You knew this would happen. The General's warnings about Kala 7 being a target. You were preparing for exactly this scenario. Yes, Deho admitted. I studied the Ravager tactics from previous battles. I saw the pattern. They disable technology, then overwhelm with close combat. Every Concordat force that faced them fell apart because they couldn't adapt. I knew that if the Ravagers came here, we needed to be ready to fight without our machines. Why didn't you tell us? Velrith asked. I did tell you, High Commander. Multiple times. You dismissed my warnings as paranoid speculation from primitives who didn't understand modern warfare. Deho's voice remained respectful, but firm. You refused to listen because you assumed humans had nothing to teach you. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Every council member remembered their condescending responses to Deho's reports. They had been so certain of their superiority. Engineer Minwu spoke for the first time. With respect, High Commanders, this isn't just about humanity being right and the Concordat being wrong. It's about different paths to strength. You developed amazing technology and became dependent on it. We developed technology too, but we never forgot the basics because we couldn't afford to. Our path wasn't better, just different. And in this specific situation against this specific enemy, our path happened to be more effective. War Marshal Threxis stood, all 6 of his arms moving in what his species used as a gesture of humility. General Deho, will humanity teach the Concordat military these methods? Will you show us how to fight the way you do? Deho looked at his officers again. Captain Jiwan with her missing arm. Lieutenant Hana with her scarred face. Private Dongwu who had risked everything twice. All the wounded, all the dead. The price of this knowledge was written in their injuries and sacrifices. We'll teach you, Deho said finally. But you need to understand something first. What we know we learned through centuries of terrible wars. Every tactic we used here was paid for in human blood across our history. We know how to fight without technology, because we spent most of our existence fighting that way. When we teach you these methods, we'll also teach you why they exist, why humans work so hard for peace even though we're good at war. We understand, Velrith said, or at least we're beginning to. The question is, how do we implement this across the entire Concordat military? The planning session lasted for hours. General Deho and his officers outlined a comprehensive reform program. Physical conditioning would become mandatory for all Concordat soldiers. Hand-to-hand combat training would be added to every military academy. Tactical exercises without computer support would become standard practice. Most importantly, the doctrine of technology dependence would end. It won't be easy, Lieutenant Hana warned. Some species will resist. They'll see this as going backward, becoming primitive. You'll need to convince them that learning old methods doesn't mean abandoning new ones. It means having options when the new methods fail. The Ravagers will help convince them, Admiral Quinteris said darkly. They're regrouping for another offensive. When word spreads about what happened here, about how humans held when others fell, people will listen.